This video goes over examples of how evolution causes new species to evolve, and how you can plot organisms on a tree to show their relationships. Just a reminder before we discuss examples of evolution, that natural selection over many generations causes evolution, and evolution is just a change in organisms over time. Here's your first evolution example. Snails can be solid yellow or brown. Yellow-shelled snails are better camouflaged in the grasslands than brown-shelled snails. Birds are the main predator of this snail. So here's your question. How do the amount of yellow snails compare to the amount of brown snails? Well, remember that birds are eating the snails, and the yellow snails are more camouflaged and therefore would be harder for the birds to see. So I think the brown snails will be eaten and the yellow snails will survive. Therefore, the number of yellow snails will be higher than the number of brown snails. Second question, make a graph showing the number of yellow snails compared to the number of brown snails. Well, I just said that there would be more yellow snails than brown snails, and even though I don't have any actual numbers, I would show that the yellow snails would have a higher bar than the brown snails. Question 3. How would natural selection have caused this difference in the number of snails? Well, let's use our trick. As a result of blank, blank survived, reproduced, and passed on their blank genes to their offspring. The blank population therefore increased. Okay, so now we have to fill in the blank. As a result of yellow snails being better camouflaged, yellow snails survived, reproduced, and passed on their yellow genes to their offspring. The yellow snail population therefore increased. Here's another example. Scientists recorded the average body size in a bird population over time. Over 1 year, a period of cold weather killed many of the birds. A few generations later, the scientists observed that the average body size in the population was larger than it had been before the cold weather. How did the bird population evolve through natural selection? Let's use our trick. As a result of the cold weather, the big birds survived, reproduced, and passed on their big body genes to their offspring. The big bird population therefore increased. Now that you're awesome at answering evolution problems, let's add some more information. If natural selection occurs for many generations, so millions of years, sometimes new species evolve. This process is called speciation, the creation of new species. So look at the picture of the birds below. At first, there are only one type of bird, and after millions and millions of years, there are now two types of birds. This is speciation. Natural selection over many generations caused new species to evolve. The original type of bird in this example, or simply the original species, is called the common ancestor. So the two new species share the common ancestor. It's like their great times a million grandfather. I keep using the word species, but what is a species? A species is organisms that look alike, act alike, and have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So this simply means that all the organisms in one species look similar, act similar, and can have babies together. By the way, the word fertile means able to reproduce. So organisms in a species have to be able to have babies that can also reproduce. In the picture to the right, there are two different species of skunks. Looking at the picture quickly though, you'd think that they were the same species because they kind of look alike, they probably act alike, but they cannot produce fertile offspring. They cannot produce babies that are healthy. As a result, they are considered two different species of skunk. What about these organisms? All of these people, are they the same or different species? Okay, well, let's go through the definition. Do they look alike? Yeah, pretty much. Maybe with some differences like skin color and hair color and face shape. But generally, yeah, they look alike. They all have two eyes and a head and arms and hair. Do they act alike? Yeah, all these people probably act alike. Can they produce babies together? Yes, they could potentially produce fertile offspring. Therefore, they are all the same species. We are all humans. That is one species. What about all these dogs? Are they the same species? They all kind of look alike. They all pretty much act alike, and they could potentially all interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They can have sex and have baby dogs. Therefore, they are all the same species. So how do these new species evolve? It's called geographic isolation. Populations of one species are physically separated for a long, long time. For example, they could be separated by a canyon or river or islands or a large mountain range. In this picture, a population of squirrels are separated by the Grand Canyon. Each of these populations is now separated from each other and can no longer interbreed and create a zygote. This means they can no longer have sex and create a baby. Therefore, gene flow stops. This means that they stop sharing genes to create a zygote. For instance, the squirrels on the left will never have sex with the squirrels on the right, and therefore they aren't sharing genes to make a baby. Each group now adapts to their own environment and accumulates enough differences to stop them from interbreeding. Therefore, they are now different species because they cannot interbreed. Back to the squirrels on the left adapt to the environment and evolve over millions of years. The squirrels on the right adapt to their environment and evolve over millions of years. Eventually, they are so different from each other that they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Therefore, they are different species. Here's another example. In one lake, there's a species of fish. The lake starts drying up, and now the fish are separated into two separate ponds. Over millions of years, the one population of fish that is now separated adapted to their own ponds and become so different that the two groups of fish can no longer interbreed. Therefore, they are considered two different species now. Same thing happened with these mice. One species of mice were physically separated from each other by a mountain range. Mice on the left adapted to the rainy forest-like environment. Mice on the right adapted to the dry desert-like environment. Eventually, the two groups of mice became so different that they could no longer interbreed. Therefore, they are different species. Charles Darwin noticed many different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands. This is why. A species of finch from the mainland of South America eventually became trapped on the individual islands and evolved to become different species. Those last examples all actually happened in nature, but what if scientists tried to repeat these experiments? Well, they did. They took one species of fly and separated them. One group ate only maltose, a type of sugar. The other group ate only starch, a type of polysaccharide. They allowed the flies to breed for many, many generations, and years later they let the two groups of flies come back together. When they did, the maltose flies only mated with the other maltose flies. The starch flies only mated with the other starch flies. These flies were now on their way to becoming two different species, even though they started as one. This last section is about biodiversity and how to organize organisms on an evolutionary tree. So remember, over the course of millions of years, new species can evolve. The way it works is that a population of organisms become geographically separated. Let's pretend on an island. The separated groups adapt to their new environment and evolve to better survive on that island. On this white island, the organisms become more white to better camouflage. On the gray island, the organisms become more gray to better camouflage. On the black island, they become darker to better camouflage. The original population is called the common ancestor because all of the new species share this ancestor. It's like their great times a million grandfather. This shows speciation, the creation of new species. They were geographically separated. They were physically separated for millions of years, and they become so different that they can no longer interbreed, and therefore they're considered different species. Because evolution can result in new species, evolution increases the biodiversity on Earth. Remember, biodiversity is the number and type of species on Earth. So because as a result of evolution there are more species, therefore biodiversity increases. Scientists can take all of these organisms and organize them onto an evolutionary tree. For example, in this picture at the bottom of the tree is the common ancestor of every single organism on Earth. Then bacteria evolve, then archaea evolve, and then eukaryotes evolve. First the protists, then the plants, then the fungus, then the animals. All the organisms on Earth fall into one of these categories. You can then arrange these categories based on which organisms evolved when. Let's look at this evolutionary tree. At the very bottom of the tree is the common ancestor of all of these organisms. So all of these organisms evolved from this common ancestor. Looking at the tree, which species is most closely related to humans? How would you know? Well, the trick is to find which species is most closely connected to humans. In this tree, the mice are connected to the humans, so it shows that they are most closely related to the humans. Mice and humans are more similar to each other than any of the other species on the tree. Well, which species is least related to the humans? Well, find the species that is farthest away from the humans. In this tree, it's the fish. First, the fish evolved from the common ancestor, then the frog evolved, then the lizard evolved, and then the mouse and the human. How do scientists know how to create these evolutionary trees? What evidence do they have? Well, the evidence is very similar to the evidence for evolution. The first piece of evidence they use is fossil evidence. If organisms have similar fossils, they are placed close together on the tree. Then they compare the structure of the organisms. If the organisms have similar bone structure, they put them close together on the tree. But per usual, the most important evidence is to compare the DNA or gene sequences. If the DNA of two species are very, very similar, they put them close together on the evolutionary tree, like humans and mice. If there are many differences between their genes, then scientists put these species far away from each other on the evolutionary tree, like humans and fish. Take this example. Which monsters are most similar? Which piece of evidence would be best to use to answer this question? Body color? Favorite food? No, the best piece of evidence is always the DNA or gene sequence, the last row. Looking at this last row, which two monsters have most similar DNA sequences? Monster 1 and Monster 2. Based on the DNA sequence of Monster 1 and Monster 2 had the most similar DNA, so they are placed together on the evolutionary tree. Notice they are right next to each other. 4 was the next most similar, so it is next closest to 1 and 2, and 3 was the most different, so it's the farthest away. Remember, scientists usually use DNA or gene sequence to figure out where to put these organisms on the tree. That's all I have. Write down your questions and ask me in class.